Today I'm going over the DJI Neo video settings, the best video settings if your plan is to fly this and then upload your content to social media. If you're not familiar with the DJI Neo, it's the only one in the DJI fleet that allows you to fly it without a remote control. And it also fits in your pocket. So it's perfect for me if I'm looking to go and grab some content on a long hike and I don't want to lug around something as heavy as my Mavic 3 Pro or Mavic 2 Pro. It also, I can palm launch this, not have to worry about connecting. So the time from I want to catch this to actually catching it and putting it back in my pocket and going about my hike is very quick. Now, I will say with the ability to fly this without the remote control, you do have the option to connect it to a controller. I'm just going over the 6 flight modes that are on the drone itself. And of those, there's Dronie, Rocket, Spotlight, Follow, Circle, and Custom. And on the Custom, you can go into the app and choose which one of the 3 flight modes you want to apply to the custom setting. I have mine on direction track. There's also Boomerang and Helix. I feel like direction track is more practical and has more practical use, whereas a Boomerang and Helix mode, kind of similar enough to Circle that I didn't feel like I was going to get enough out of it. But you do have the ability to apply those, whichever one you want. You just have to go into the app and set that. Now, as I mentioned, this is a pocket-sized drone. It's also 199 bucks. So you can't necessarily get the world as far as the video capability. And what I mean by that is this does shoot in 4K, but ideally I would like to shoot in 4K at the 9:16 aspect ratio for social media. And then I would also like to have 60 frames per second capability when I'm shooting. But this doesn't allow you to have the setting on 4K and shoot 60 frames per second. If you choose to shoot in 4K with this, you are shooting in a 16:9 landscape ratio, and you can only shoot up to 30 frames per second. And then if you're going to upload to social media, then you have to go in and in post crop that to 9:16, which means that you're losing some resolution from the original 4K anyway, right? So if I choose the 9:16 mode in settings, I'm only going to be able to shoot 1080p, but I do gain the ability to shoot in 60 frames per second. So there's a give and a take there. You can also shoot in 1080p in a 16:9 landscape mode, but I feel like what's the point? I want to shoot the highest quality and I want to shoot the highest frames per second, because what I'll get into in just a moment is this thing does a really great job of fighting the wind. But if it's a bit of a windy day, it's gonna fight for its life. And being able to slow down the footage makes a kind of a ruined shot recoverable, because I can slow it down about half speed and it takes those bumps out of the footage. I'm gonna show the footage that I took side by side. I did each flight setting starting from Dronie, and I shot it in 4K at 30 frames per second. I then shot the same flight mode in 1080p at the 9:16 aspect ratio at 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second. When I'm showing the side-by-side footage, I already took the 4K 16:9 footage and cropped it in to be 9:16. So you really see a true side-by-side comparison. I started with Dronie. So with the Dronie, I've got 2 of these side by side here, and what you can see kind of right off the bat is image quality is not much different. So you see the 4K at 30 frames per second. It looks just about similar to that 1080p at 60 frames per second. Now, when you're doing a Dronie, it's going to capture 2 video clips. One, when you're shooting furthest away, is going to be about a 10-second clip moving away from you, and then it captures another 10-second clip moving in back to you. You'll notice the distance. You're not going to be able to shoot as far because you have to crop in with that 4K. This is already cropped from 16:9 to 9:16 on the 4K. whereas the 1080p 9:16, that's already cropped in the camera. It does a great job at having a feel of being a lot further away when it really went the same distance. In this video setting, I would give really not priority on shooting at 60 frames per second, because most dronies, you're standing still. You don't really need the extra 60 frames per second to slow it down. Unless it's just a really windy day, you might need that. But by and large, when I'm shooting a Dronie, I actually like to do the 16:9 landscape, only because I'm typically not just shooting myself. I want to get as much of the landscape as possible. I don't need the 60 frames per second. I don't really mind that the distance, you can't really get as far. I typically would say that the Dronie 16:9 at 4K is going to be the one to get the check mark on this. Now, your next one is Rocket. Rocket is a little bit similar in that the drone is going to put its camera straight down. It's going to go skyward, straight up, and you can choose to have it slowly rotate, or you can have it just go directly straight up. I say it's a bit similar to Dronie because in this mode, the subject is typically not moving. So because you're stationary, I'm going to give the same advice. 4K landscape at 30 frames per second. Next one is Spotlight. Now, Spotlight was a little bit surprising. I would say that shooting in this mode, if you're not familiar, Spotlight will let the drone hover, and then it's going to follow its subject, but it's not going to follow you like follow mode. It's just going to stay stationary, and it's just going to move. If you move, it's just going to track your movement. But distance-wise, it's going to stay on basically a rotating swivel. Now, shooting these two side by side, looking at a test of me running around, 9:16, 60 frames per second really wins out, because if you want to slow down this footage and get some cinematic slow movements, you can't. I mean, it just looks pretty terrible on the 4K 30 frames per second, no matter how much you, even if you just bump it down to half speed, it just looks kind of bad. I'm going to give it a definite yes to the portrait mode on this one. Shoot 9:16, 1080p at 60 frames per second. The next flight mode I tried was direction track, and this is one of the custom modes on the drone itself. Very similar to follow, but wherever you set the flight mode, it's going to follow you in that path, so you can actually walk forward and have the drone follow you, kind of flying backwards. You can tell when you're looking at the 4K footage that is cropped from 16:9 to 9:16, you're not able to get the distance away from the subject that looks better, as you can see in the 1080p footage that's already shot in 9:16 digital crop. So the best video setting for direction track would be to shoot it in 1080p at 9:16 aspect ratio, that digital crop, at 60 frames per second. The next mode, which is Follow Me. Follow Me, again, very similar. The drone itself is going to sense you as the subject, and it's just going to follow you at the distance that you choose. I choose to have this at the furthest away and highest it'll go, so that it's not cropping off part of my body. And as you can see in this footage, it just looks better when you're shooting in the 9:16 aspect ratio that's already digitally cropped. It looks like it's further away from me than the 4K that's cropped in. This also, I'm slowing down the footage at some points. You can see where you really get those smooth movements still on the 1080p footage that's 60 frames per second. So another one goes to the 9:16 1080p at 60 frames per second for the follow flight path, or follow flight mode. Last one I did was Circle. Now, Circle is going to be a bit different, even though your subject is usually going to be stationary, like Dronie and like Rocket, where I said, go ahead and shoot it on 16:9, shoot it on landscape format. It's not really the case with circle, right? Because with circle, I want it to be farther away. And you can see that when you crop this in, it's just right on you. And, you know, unless you're trying to shoot something quickly just of yourself, and you really don't want to get a whole lot of the background and the focus to be anything else but you, I think the better looking footage comes from shooting at the cropped 9:16 1080p at 60 frames per second, because it also looks really cool being able to slow down part of that circle and speed it up. I do a clip where I went to the Great Sand Dunes and, you know, slow down a little part of it, and then, you know, back of my head, I want it to be one continuous shot, but nobody wants to spend like 5 seconds looking at the back of your head, so I can quickly speed that footage up and then slow it down right in front of me. It just gives me more flexibility if I'm shooting in 60 frames per second to do something like that. So winner to that one, 9:16 again, go ahead and shoot in the portrait mode. So just to recap, out of the 6 flight modes that I tested, and the first 2 being Dronie and Rocket, both of those flight modes, the best video setting for them, I think, is the landscape 16:9 ratio, because you can shoot in 4K and you don't need the added 60 frames per second. You're not really needing to slow down the footage very much. For the remaining flight modes on the drone, which are spotlight, follow, direction track, and circle, the digital crop in the camera of actually cropping 9:16 in the camera, I think flat out wins. Even though you're only able to shoot it on 1080p, I value the distance from the subject a lot better. I think the footage looks a lot nicer, and the ability to shoot in 60 frames per second gives me a lot more flexibility in post. As far as distance, framing, and flexibility for frames per second, most of the flight modes on this drone, I'm going to default to the 9:16 digital crop in the camera. Shoot it at 60 frames per second. Even if you shoot the Dronie and the Rocket modes in 9:16, you're really not losing out on much. So if you're gonna do one video setting on this, let's say you just wanna set it and forget it, I'm new at this, I don't want to change things based on my flight settings, I would say that hands down, you're not going to go wrong with setting it to the portrait 9:16, which is the digital crop in camera on the drone. 9:16, set it to 60 frames per second. It is the 1080p by default. You can't get higher resolution, but we've been over why the 4K really isn't that much better if your plan is to upload this to social media. I don't think you're gonna find a more universal, better overall setting for each one of these flight modes than that one. And if you like this kind of content, please let me know in the comments below and subscribe. I'll be making this kind of content each week. Thanks.